This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome. You've heard it read the spin the media and the politicians have put on the issues of the day. To get the correct spin on what's going on in North Carolina, let's introduce you to our panel of experts. They include syndicated columnist, soon to be newly released again author John Hood, former Secretary of State, former Attorney General Rufus Edmisten, former House Speaker Josephus Mavretic, and current NC Policy Watch head Chris Fitzsimon. Well, welcome to our Labor Day edition this week on NC Spin, quiet movements that might signify behind-the-scenes action on the budget. We talk about whether the Supreme Court will again affirm the 2011 legislative and congressional districts, and we consider claims being made that education is roaring back as school data and test results are being released. Let's get started. Things were quiet this week in the legislature, and when they are, it usually means something's going on behind the scenes. Throughout the week, we kept getting reassurances progress was being made on a state budget. We understood that agencies like Justice and Public Safety, DENR, and other agencies in general government had been resolved. We also learned that the Senate was willing to restore funding for teacher assistants, but that the monies had to be used only for assistance, and funding for drivers' education would be restored. But there are other items still being negotiated, and we want to ask our panel to talk about those that include Medicaid reform, economic development funded, expanded lottery advertising, and others. John, just how close are they to getting a budget agreement, and what do you hear they're really struggling to resolve?
Well, they're getting there. They are struggling to resolve some matters, and people were wondering whether there must be some secret side deals or complicated issues that are being resolved that we haven't heard about. Actually, I'm told the main stumbling blocks really are the ones people are talking about. The overall amount of money spent, particularly the appropriations in education, and how those appropriations can be spent. It used to be an article of faith among Republicans, conservatives, and actually people on the Democratic side as well, that school districts needed more budgetary autonomy. Even if you were going to increase standards for student achievement or graduation rates or other kinds of accountability from Raleigh, that you ought to let school districts have more authority to transfer money within budget codes. That was, until very recently, part of the ruling Republican philosophy about governing, about budgeting. Now the Senate seems to be going in a different direction. Some of the House is interested, some of the House isn't. So I think that has been one of the issues, but there are quite a few others.
But Chris, Governor McCrory and House leadership said no to the deal on teacher assistance, we understand, and perhaps with that, the driver's education. What's the hang-up there?
Well, I think part of it is the flexibility that John mentioned. I mean, it's noteworthy that the Senate, who was sort of downplaying the value of teacher assistance and saying that we're far better spending money hiring teachers in the early grades to reduce class size by a few pupils, is now saying we're willing to fund all the teacher assistance. We just want to make sure the money is going there. I actually think that caught some House members off guard, and they're still trying to figure out how to respond to that. I still think there are discussions about what additional tax cuts to make, which I think are unwise, but the Senate leadership still wants to make some additional tax cuts beyond the automatic corporate tax rate reduction. So I think there's dozens, literally dozens, of small individual provisions that the Senate put in its budget that we haven't heard anything about.
But Rufus, let me ask you, going back to the question on teacher assistance, what's the objection to giving the local school entities flexibility for how they spend the money? What's the Senate so upset about?
Well, I'll put it this way. State government has done it for years, and that's how you keep things going. When I was Secretary of State, if something was failing in the corporate division, I could move some money over there. So there's nothing wrong with that. And I might add, too, that if what I read about the lottery, them talking about doing all those things they're talking about, we can become the Las Vegas of state-sponsored gambling. I've never heard such stuff in my life, and I hope that gets scuttled immediately.
Joe, one of the things that occurs to me in all of this is that the longer these budget negotiations continue, the more likely the House position is going to come out on the short end.
Really?
So far,
because so far it looks like the House has sort of prevailed over the Senate.
I don't think so. I would caution our viewers to keep close tabs on this and who's gaining and who's losing.
Chris, one of the stories that came out this week involving Medicaid reform was obviously where Medicaid is going to reside, whether under DHHS or whether a new agency. But we also heard a lot of talk about the CCNC audit that was taken, and some of the members of the Senate caucus reportedly were upset with Senate leadership because Senate leadership had seen that audit for several weeks before it was released publicly, and they didn't know about it, and they weren't happy about it. And now I understand that the Main Street Democrats are ultimately saying to the Speaker that if CCNC is not in a Medicaid reform package, they won't vote for a budget.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised about that. I think that what's fascinating about the audit is the General Assembly asked for it, and I think part of the motivation was we don't believe some of these numbers that are coming out of CCNC in terms of money saved. Well, the auditor did it and found out that it is indeed saving money. What's interesting to me is it doesn't seem to have slowed down the Senate reform efforts any. The question will be, you mentioned the Main Street Democrats. I still think there is a significant amount of support for CCNC in the House and not in the Senate.
Well,
that's one of the things they're negotiating.
Speaker Moore can't pass a budget without Democrats, can he?
Well,
Yeah, he can pass it, but
he ought to be able to.
He's got some factions in his
but he has a
own party.
supermajority of support. It's a reflection of his leadership. If he has a supermajority of his own party, he can't pass
What's
the budget.
going on with the tax redistribution thing? We thought it had sort of died. Now it's being resurrected. We understand. What's going on?
I don't think it's died. I don't think it ever died. I think it may have gone under the.
Is the 50-50 provision still the one that's in play, or are there some other changes?
Keep in mind, there's a whole bunch of different things in play. There's a potential horse trading festival about to occur.
That's right.
We'll see what comes out the other end, so to speak.
All I have to say about that is nay.
The governor has been really clear, even with the 50-50 split, that he didn't like it and would consider vetoing it. So that's a whole other factor.
All right. Well, last week we told you about a change in stations in our Greenville, Washington, Newbern market. This week we're pleased to announce that NC Spin is going to begin airing on Fox 8 and Fox 14 in Greenville, Washington, Newbern at 8 a.m. beginning Sunday, September 13th. So set your DVRs, be sure to tune in. You can still watch the show from our website, ncspin.com, or on YouTube, and NC Spin on Facebook. That's Balanced Debate for the Old North State on ncspin.com, NC Spin on Facebook, or on Twitter at NC Spin Tweets. Next, the Supreme Court rehears redistricting.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
Phones are getting smarter, cars more efficient, TVs bigger and more stunning. Imagine the same innovation from agriculture. Meet the Plant Sciences Initiative at NC State, a proposed state-of-the-art research complex where world-class researchers will tackle agriculture's toughest challenges, like feeding the world's rapidly growing population while preserving natural resources for future generations. Join Farm Bureau and NC State in moving North Carolina to the forefront of ag research in the world. Visit keepaggrowing.org.
Clean transportation options can help you fuel what matters.
We're fueling what matters to us by converting our fleet of collection trucks over to compressed natural gas. It's a good, smart business decision, and having the air cleaner is something that benefits all the families that work with us.
We use biodiesel in our heavy equipment. We've got propane in a lot of our police cars. And we've really embraced the electric car. Join the city of Raleigh
and fuel what matters.
To learn how you can fuel what matters, visit fuelwhatmatters.org.
The cost of everything has gone up dramatically over the last 75 years. With one exception, keeping electricity affordable. That's the power of your co-op membership. Learn more at togetherwesave.com.
North Carolina's Touchstone Energy Cooperatives, looking out for you.
We now return to NC Spin.
Our state Supreme Court ruled that the congressional and legislative districts drawn in 2011 were constitutional, but their decision was appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and that court vacated the state court verdict and remanded it back for further review. In light of their decision that Alabama had used mechanical means for race-based goals, and it wasn't justified under the Voting Rights Act. Our state Supreme Court heard arguments this week from Tom Farr representing the state and from lawyers representing the plaintiffs. Rufus, you were Attorney General for the state. What do you think the U.S. Supreme Court meant when they remanded the case, they vacated the verdict of our Supreme Court and told the court to review their decision?
Well, just like this king of sports is redistricting. It was when I was Attorney General, always will be. First of all, courts consider that a political decision unless you have some kind of racial connection with it. Now, what happened is they said go back as we said in Alabama, and look district by district, House, Senate, congressional districts, and see if you were packing them in there. I think somebody said pack, stack, and shellac or something like that. What this actually says is that I don't think much is going to happen. Now, they can say go back and tweak it. I don't think you're going to have any election delays. I think you will have some unhappy parties, and I'll tell you, one side says, okay, boy, we're going to throw the whole thing out. The other side says it's just procedural. It is not procedural. There's some serious things there.
So, Chris, what do you expect? Rufus says he's not expecting much to happen. They're going to reaffirm the verdict. But there was an interesting repartee between Justice Robin Hudson and Tom Farr, the attorney. And she asked him in so many words, why do you think the Supreme Court vacated this decision? He answered it by saying they frequently will ask states to go back and review. She said, but specifically, why did they vacate it then? There's a difference between vacate and review, isn't there?
Well, the whole issue comes, and we've talked about on this show before, the Alabama case. The Supreme Court clearly found that Alabama was packing African-American voters in districts to dilute their overall voting strength and elect Republicans, using race to elect people of a certain political party, the Republican Party. The question, and North Carolina did it too. The question is, what's the threshold? As we said on this show before, there are legislative districts where they clearly packed African-American voters in for a political advantage. That's not a new tactic, but it is new that the Supreme Court is now looking at it in the way in the Alabama case. I think that we're not going to have a resolution before the next election, certainly, but I would not be surprised if the districts were adjusted at some point in the next 2 or 3 years.
Tom, I've watched redistricting for 4 times now, 40 years worth, and what it boils down to, it is about race, and it's because the Social Democrats want the maximum leverage from the black vote, and the conservatives want the least leverage from the black vote. And the issue is, where are you going to come down between the two?
Well, and John, the question is whether our map drawing was different from that in Alabama.
That's the critical question.
And they said that in some of the Alabama districts there was 70% minority voting registration, whereas in North Carolina the highest percentage was like 57, 58%.
Right.
They think that's significant enough to make a difference.
They argue, that's the state's main argument. There's a distinguishing characteristic between Alabama and North Carolina. In North Carolina, they went for essentially majority black districts. In some cases, a little bit more than that. And in Alabama, they really did pack as many black voters as possible into districts, pushing those percentages way up and creating more opportunities. They think this is a significant difference. And basically, the plaintiffs are granting there's a difference, but saying the real issue is, should you have a requirement of majority black districts at all? They don't think so. They think it would be okay to have black districts that are, 40% or so African American, because they think that maximizes African American power.
Rufus, one of the things that was interesting in this is that Tom Farr admitted these districts were drawn politically so as to ensure that the Republicans would get reelected.
Perfectly legal, has been since the beginning of the time.
But it was noted by the plaintiffs. This is the first time the Republicans had actually admitted that. Prior to that time, they were saying they were trying to follow the Voting Rights Act. And how significant is that?
I think that's very significant, but it won't make any difference. And the whole tragedy of this thing is that we do this foolishly. We need to have independent commissions. The sooner we get to it and have the backbone to do it, you'll do away with this tomfoolery.
Now, look, I'm all in favor of redistricting reform and have been for decades. But you first have to get a clear signal from somebody like the U.S. Supreme Court about what the Voting Rights Act means. Until we have a clear signal, that's the problem. Once you have a clear signal, a clear test from somebody in authority, then you can build basically mathematical formulas to create districts.
Chris says that,
but until then you can't.
Chris says we won't get a verdict before the 2016 elections in all probability. The last time the Supreme Court took 9 months to make a decision. One way or the other, though, isn't it going to be appealed, Joe?
Of course it is. And one of the things that I think will be considered is, if you look at numbers right now, North Carolina is no longer the 10th largest state in the country. It's the 9th largest state in the country. And so that, for me, gives me a little wedgie here to make some tweaky changes and cover it up by saying we had unexpected demographic movement and change and we need to tweak.
To John's point, though, Rufus, they've got these computers models now that they can sit down and they can put in some parameters, some basic parameters. Here's how we want North Carolina's districts drawn, and that computer can spit out these districts in something like 15 minutes. Why wouldn't our legislature want something like that to take place?
Well, because they want to stay in office the way it is.
Okay, but I mean, even so, you can draw it so it favors incumbents.
And my wonderful colleague here, I sort of disagree with him. With all that the gizmos we've got right now, you could draw something that Supreme Court wouldn't even have to look at if you got away from all these numbers like 70% and this and that. So I don't think you have to have a definitive answer if you do the thing the way it should be. Try to not make these things look like the Aleutian Islands and some kind of a salamander running all over the state.
But if you drew the districts in perfect concentric sort of design, that would violate the Voting Rights Act.
Yeah.
It absolutely would.
And
that's the problem.
And I was actively involved in the 81 redistricting, which took 2 years to settle. And there wasn't any question in anybody's mind, Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative, made no difference that this was a racial issue and that we were handling from a race point of view.
All right, after these messages, we're going to talk about fewer schools passing the state scores.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
It's a fact. Patients who receive care in the medical home from a trusted family physician reduce healthcare costs through prevention, early detection, and affordable management of high-cost chronic diseases.
Every dollar invested in healthcare matters. Let's invest them wisely, building on North Carolina's medical home model. Better health begins with a medical home, a trusted family physician, the best return on our healthcare investment. Learn about the importance of medical homes at ournchealthcare.com.
Opportunity moves at the speed of broadband, but is rural NC stalled at dial-up? Join the conversation. Attend the NC Rural Assembly on September 29th, a discussion on broadband connectivity and rural NC opportunities. Register now at ncruralcenter.org.
You sleep on concrete till your body get immune to concrete.
My mom got my brother and I up and said, "Come on, we're leaving."
I became homeless in the beginning of this year.
When I was about 4 or 5 years old, our house caught fire.
I used to see my brother. If he see me, he'd turn and go the other direction.
We did the only thing that we could think of, and we went to a Salvation Army shelter.
You know, we don't have this, like, what's your background look like? We just say, what do you need?
I remember the man from the Salvation Army coming down with a box of clothes.
The Salvation Army officer bought my brother and I an ice cream cone.
Last week, my brother walked up to me, and he just started a conversation.
Today I've given my life to the Salvation Army because I remember what somebody did for me, my brother, and my mom over 30 years ago.
The Salvation Army for me means hope.
Compassion.
Family.
Support.
We now return to NC Spin.
The legislature required that scores for each school in our state be assigned a letter grade from A to F. And you might remember that there was a lot of disappointment earlier this year when the first scores were announced, even though they were delayed. Well, the state has just released the second year's results, and they were not encouraging either. Based on a 15-point scale, where A is between 85 and 100 points, 72% of our schools received a C or better grade. But if you use a 10-point scale, and applied it, 70% would have received a D or F. Even though 85% of our students graduated from high school this past year, the overall rate of growth for individual students dropped slightly. Joe, Representatives Craig Horn and Rob Bryan, the co-chairs of the House Education Committee, recently wrote an op-ed piece in the Charlotte Observer that said under their leadership, education is roaring back as the pride of our state. You think these test scores meet their definition of roaring back?
Hardly. I think if you read their column in the paper, it's clear that it's written by two people who combined have under their belt 3 sessions of a General Assembly. One of them is in his third and the other one is in his second. And they're head of the Appropriations Committee on the House side of the most important business of the state. And I think you have to take anything that they say with a grain of salt. It's my opinion, looking at the numbers, that North Carolina, if we are intended to graduate good citizens, are failing to graduate somewhere between 15 and 20% of the primary or the public school people. If we look at good citizenship, look at the incarceration rate, look at the voting percentages, look at the trash beside the roadside. If we're talking about good citizens with skills needed in the marketplace, North Carolina consistently for 4 education governors has ranked below average nationally in individual household income. So, no, we are not off to a big start.
Rufus, overall, 56% of the students pass these statewide exams in reading, math, and science. What does that say to you, 56%?
Well, it says it's pretty poor. And my question is this. If you make below 85, are you going to get any help, or do you get punished? If you make above 85, you're going to get praise and say, keep on, keep on. I don't care what kind of numerical scoring system you use, what are you going to do about the results of the scoring system? So that system means nothing to me. I'm an old teacher. That's probably the most ridiculous grading thing I've ever heard of in my life for a school system.
Chris, again, and this is no surprise to anybody, the schools that scored the lowest were the ones with students who had, a majority of students had low socioeconomic backgrounds and low wealth schools. The question is, what can we realistically expect our schools to do about these socioeconomic problems?
Well, there's 2 things about that. I think it was roughly 98% of the schools that received an F had a majority of kids who were low income. 90, I think it's the high 80s or low 90s. No, more than that. I think 94% who scored a D. So clearly, the low income schools.
It's a problem.
Well, the 2 things about that. First of all, the formula, which I thought we had agreed to, is ridiculous, because even if those poor schools, low income schools, improve significantly, they start from so far behind that their grade is still a D or an F. So first of all, the formula is a joke, and I thought we had philosophical agreement in North Carolina that we need to change the formula if we're going to keep this grading system.
The formula, by the way, is 80% based on the students' test scores and 20% on based on growth.
Right. So if you're really far behind at the beginning, you can make significant progress and not move up at a letter grade. And the second point is the whole, we've talked about on this program before, the plan to help turn around schools that Representative Bryan is working on behind the scenes, talks about increasing services to poor kids in poor school systems. We can do that already. We don't need a whole new system to do that. We have to help the students and their families. That's the only way, I think, to improve these test scores.
But John, aren't we just kind of prolonging failure for these students in other schools when we are mainstreaming them in classrooms with students that are performing at or above grade level? Don't they need more help than just can get in an average classroom?
Well, there's a lot of debate about whether that's the most appropriate situation. It probably depends on the context and the personnel and the particular students involved, rather than making a statewide policy. These test scores were the worst nightmare for journalists and political activists on both sides, because you know what? The news was, there is no news. There was no consequential change one way or the other. Schools didn't get much worse. They didn't get much better. The graduation rate went up some, but we're not sure what that means. I mean, it does mean that the graduation rate is being correctly measured now, unlike when it was being faked and they said it was 95% and nonsense like that. So it's been correctly measured, but the students may be graduating without really being prepared for the world of work and college. That's the problem. So it's a stagnation problem.
All right. After these messages, we're going to ask the panel to tell us something we don't know.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
Hey everyone, I'm Linda Loveland. If feeding your family safe, affordable foods is a priority for you, then join me in saying thanks to the North Carolina farmers who feed us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let's say thanks to the farmers who feed your family at #ThankNCFarmers. To learn more about the foods we eat and the farm families who feed us, visit feedthedialoguenc.com. And be sure to thank North Carolina farmers.
Every year, North Carolina patients undergo 635,000 same-day surgeries. 72% of these surgeries are performed in our highest-cost hospital facilities, adding as much as $2,000 to every procedure. The state's outdated Certificate of Need law prevents competition from lower-cost, higher-quality same-day surgery centers, inflating healthcare costs and limiting patient choice. Tell state lawmakers it's time to lower health care costs now. It's time to make a simple fix to an outdated law, increasing patient choice and lowering health care costs now. You can help. Visit reformconnow.com and tell lawmakers it's time for a simple fix to an outdated law. It's time to lower health care costs now.
All right, it's time to ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. Chris Fitzsimon, I'll start with you.
Well, we talked a lot about the budget provisions on the show, things that might be holding the budget up. This week we learned that the Senate leadership has snuck in a provision in the budget, or is trying to sneak it in, which would allow coastal communities to build terminal groins or hardened structures off the coast. 2013, after a huge fight for years, we allowed 4 pilot projects to see how that was going to work. None of those have even been built. And now these folks want to completely open that up, and I think that's actually there's a lot of opposition in the House. That's a sleeper issue that could hold the budget up a day or two.
Joe,
2 commerce comments. Speaker Moore appointed George Robinson as the top chair for the Commerce Committee, and now all of McCrory administration business and commerce bills are going to go through George Robinson. And former Secretary Sharon Decker is now Senior Vice President for the Tryon International Equestrian Center. And with her in place, that venue is going to take off.
All right. Rufus Edmiston, tell us something we don't know.
I hear that the University Board of Governors is interviewing local, native North Carolinians, business types for the position of President of the Consolidated University. Might tell you where we're going.
All right. You willing to leak any names that you've heard?
No, sir.
All right. John Hood, tell us something we don't know.
Tom, you know I like to watch state-by-state rankings, and there's a new one out of community college systems in the country. North Carolina ranked 11th. This is a ranking that includes cost of and efficiency of the system, and also the wages that community college graduates earn and their subsequent success at 4-year schools. North Carolina doing well, but not as well in our region as Florida, and believe it or not, Mississippi. They rank higher.
Any reason why?
They have higher returns for the graduates of their community college systems. But again, we still rank pretty well.
Yeah, 11th in the nation.
In the
We've always
good.
had a lot of pride in our community college system. Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, give your feedback and read our weekly column. Be sure to visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch NC Spin on Facebook. And we hope you'll join us next week when NC Spin will have more balanced debate for the Old North State. Until then, stay informed, happy Labor Day, and watch out for the spin.
Join us next week and get the spin on issues facing our state.